perhaps have more nights like this and get some other topics of interest that people might talk about. So if any of you are inspired to come up with a presentation on something, then talk to me after. But for tonight, it's the history of Sheffield, kind of a whirlwind tour, mostly in the very earlier times. And my name is Marty Coleman, for those of you who don't know me, and I've been interested in the local history for a long time, since I was a kid, and it's been sort of a lifelong passion to learn more about it. And sometimes I'm into it more than others, but it's kind of fun. More and more things come up over the years. People find new records, well, old records that nobody's seen before, and you can add to the story. So I'm going to go way back, prehistoric times. Oh, and if you have any questions or comments, is that the feedback I hear? Oh, okay. Thought I heard some feedback. Any questions or comments, feel free, just raise your hand or shout out or whatever you like to do. And going back a few thousand years, Owen, could you turn the light on for me, please, Henry? Thanks. So you could go back millions of years, for life of some kind here. Apparently, for a long time, it was just kind of a big sea with all kinds of sea creatures living in this area. I don't have any slides of those. There's fossils you can find of that sort of thing. But where I'm going to pick up is the time when it's believed that humans were definitely active in the area, living and hunting. And that was at the time of the last ice age, which, about 10 or 12,000 years ago. And the kind of, what I understand to be the main animals that were around were ones that wore these on their head. Anybody recognize those antlers? What animal that is? Just shout it out.
Moose.
Close, but no, sorry. Good try. What's that, sorry? No, mammoths were supposed to be around at the same time, though. As far as I know, there's been no mammoth remains found around Sheffield, although there have been in Oxford County. Someone said reindeer. Yeah, that's a reindeer or a caribou antler. And very rare. From what they told me, I've been wrong. There's never been any other complete caribou antlers found in southern Ontario. They haven't been around for the last 10,000 years. And what remains have ever been found are just fragments. And these were found on John Pitton's original farm along Highway 97 in a sort of a boggy corner of the farm, which preserved them. So that was quite amazing. But anyway, humans, some of the earlier indigenous people made their living hunting caribou, just as people have in the Arctic as well, up until more recent times. And so that went on for several thousand years around here with the Ice Age. And that phase, with the glaciers and all that, I'm hoping maybe to get Walt Scott to come in. I don't know how many of you have ever seen his presentation that has a lot of the prehistoric things about the glaciers and all that. He has a really interesting presentation on that, so I'll maybe save some of that for him, wishful thinking. But anyway, after the Ice Age, of course, things warmed up around here, and you had what's known as hunter-gatherers. The indigenous people were still hunting, but the caribou had moved further north with the ice, and there was a lot more diverse game to be hunted, as well as different plants that they could gather for food as well. And that kind of lifestyle was the one that went on for the biggest part of history, or prehistory here, thousands of years. And the indigenous people that are believed to have been living here that way would be part of the Anishinaabe family, like the Ojibwe and the Mississaugas, who we're probably kind of familiar with because of the city that's named after them, and there's the reserve that's kind of beside the Six Nations Reserve near Brantford for some of the Mississauga. There's Mississauga all over the place. But anyway, that was their kind of lifestyle, moving around, not really having any big settlements. Apparently, they did build wigwams with bark and some kind of structures that they would put up, and they were kind of temporary. They would move them around, so they didn't really have any villages. But villages did come a bit later. Another indigenous group that moved in that people are maybe a bit more familiar with. Archaeologists often call them the Iroquois, and that includes the Six Nations, the Huron, the Erie, and the Neutral, who were actually the ones that lived around this area. And we don't really know, as far as I've heard, what name they call themselves or called themselves. The French called them the Neutral because they stayed out of the wars, or they tried to stay out of the wars between the Iroquois and I'm sure the Six Nations and the Huron. They were called the Adelwanderans by the Huron, but that just meant people who speak a different language or a different dialect. They were kind of cousins of each other way back. They lived a similar lifestyle. They lived in these kind of villages with long houses, and they were basically a type of farming culture that grew what's called the Three Sisters, including corn and squash and beans, which all sort of grew together symbiotically, helping each other out. So they brought corn into the area and squash and beans. And from what I've learned, which might be a bit outdated, but it was believed that that culture had gradually been migrating from Central America from centuries earlier. And that culture was fairly successful because they were able to have a more dense population and with all the food they were producing. And that meant that they had a bit of an advantage in occupying territory and fighting against people that were already there. They had superiority of numbers, or at least they did for a while. So these villages are, there's been a number of them found in southern Ontario, and I believe there was something found a long time ago, over 100 years ago, on a farm down Settlers Road, the main farm, and we've got Carol who grew up on that farm here tonight. So I don't know if Carol remembers anything about what was found on that farm. It was way before her time, but
we found a lot of arrowheads.
Right.
There was a village just on the other side of our property. We could tell because they found bones and stuff there too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe what I understood, it was excavated just like way back when archaeology was not really that well established. It was more of a treasure hunt in some ways. But yeah, the custom that they had was to live in a village for 20 or 30 years, and then they had kind of exhausted the soil somewhat where they were growing the crops, and they would relocate, build a village somewhere else and start over again. So there's probably lots more of them around that haven't been found, but that's one that was definitely in this area. And this is a replica of a longhouse. I think that's at Crawford Lake. If you want to see this kind of thing, Crawford Lake up by Milton is really excellent how they've recreated this. And I should mention too, on pointing out people who are here, Rebecca Brain did a really good thesis about the Neutral who were living in the longhouses here at this time. And we're talking about, probably sometime after year 0, they figured that they started getting established in southern Ontario, and then up into the 1600s, they were here, and would have had to push out the Mississaugas in order to establish themselves. So this is what they've got at Crawford Lake on the inside, and multiple families would live inside one of these longhouses. And I'm nowhere near an expert on Indigenous history, so this is a very general look at it. I hope to get someone like Rebecca or other people to maybe talk more about this phase of history. And there is, apart from people finding arrowheads, like Carol was talking about, there was a really big relic, again down Settlers Road on what was the Decker farm, sort of behind George Tucker's place. They had this big stone there that had the hollowed out bowl in it, which was apparently used for grinding the corn. So that was the mortar, and then they would have a wooden pestle for crushing the corn in it. So that was an important part of their food production. What ended up happening in the 1600s, that was the end of the neutral, these wars between the Huron and the Iroquois, a lot of it was to do with trying to get it corner the fur trade market and trying to wipe each other out so that they could get more monopoly. And it ended up, I think there were 5 nations at the time, ended up just kind of crushing a lot of the other, some of them were not just tribes, they were confederacies, like the neutral, they were a bunch of tribes that were associated with each other. And in the past, it was sometimes thought that they just wiped them all out, wiped out the Huron, wiped out the neutral. But there's lots of stories now that these local neutral, or the tribe that lived probably around Sheffield, we believe is called the Ontuaronan. But it's believed that most of them would have been absorbed into the 5 nations because they lost a lot of their own people, a lot of their warriors during these wars. And it was their practice to rebuild their numbers just by taking prisoners and saying, all right, you're one of us now. And apparently they had entire villages in what's now New York State that were all neutral indigenous people from around southern Ontario. So a lot of them ended up there, and apparently some of them ended up going south of Montreal, and some of those reserves there are believed to have a lot of descendants of the neutral. So after the 5 nations had defeated all these tribes here, all their fellow Iroquois, the territory was in theory theirs, but they went back to what's now New York and the Finger Lakes area, and they didn't really do much with this area here, and the Mississaugas ended up taking it back over again, an area that they had lost many centuries ago. They were able to retake, so that worked out kind of nicely for them. And then into the 1700s, after the American Revolution, Britain was looking for somewhere to settle the Americans who were loyal to them, the Loyalists, and they, in addition to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, they wanted somewhere further west where they could send Loyalists from New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and so they took a piece off of Quebec and negotiated with the Mississaugas that were holding it here and bought land from them. So that brings us up into what you might call the European settlement phase of non-Indigenous people settling here. And as far as we can tell, not too many people came to this part of Beverly Township early on. The southern parts along Highway 99 were more popular at first. The Cokes were loyalists who settled, where Coketown is now. And people didn't come further north. What's now Highway 8 was just a trail, had to go through a really swampy area between Rockton and Sheffield that people were kind of afraid of. There was quicksand, rattlesnakes, wolves and bears. And the other thing I forgot to point out when we were talking about the indigenous history, this image here is what well, there's one theory that the whole province was always just a very dense forest and, pretty hard to grow things in because there was such a thick canopy of trees. But there's a theory now or it's new to me anyway, that the indigenous people for centuries or millennia maintained what's known as an oak savanna in large parts of the province. And that would be a sort of a environment like what you're seeing there, where the trees are kind of sparse, and that was better for their hunting deer and buffalo, left things a lot more open, and they would maintain that by doing regular burning the grass when it was dry, and that would stimulate new growth and it would stop trees from taking over. And what happened apparently when European people first started coming over in the late 1400s and into the 1500s and bringing over these diseases that the indigenous people had never encountered before, and they had no immunity whatsoever. It's believed that 90% of them were wiped out within a century by these diseases that they had no resistance for. And it probably just went across North America like wildfire, and a lot of them probably had no idea what was going on, where this sickness was coming from or anything. And so they were not able to maintain the landscape in this way for the most part, and the forest did take back over. And this happened around the same time as what's known as the Little Ice Age, and so the theory also suggests that when all these trees, took over, that took a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and caused global cooling, which is something that was happening at that time. The Little Ice Age was a time where the climate was cooling and things were getting a bit tougher to grow crops and so on. So anyway, that was one thing that happened when Europeans arrived, apparently. So as far as the Sheffield area, this area was kind of passed over for a couple decades. Apparently, the first settler in the area settled on what's now Norman Road. There probably was no road there at all. But it's funny, I think there's two different people here tonight who live where this is now. It's Richard Boothby's property now, and he's here tonight. Some of you might know it as the Knight Farm. And then Domino Souza is here, and she lives right across from Richard's house, and that was part of the same farm originally. So that was originally, by the pioneers, it was called Peck's Clearing. There was a guy named Linus Peck, who was the first recorded settler around here. In 1800, he started making a clearing, and assuming he lived in a log cabin or something, he cleared 10 acres, and then he cleared out for no apparent reason. He shows up again in 1812. He fought in the war in 1812, and apparently he was living in Mississauga at that time. But anyway, as far as permanent settlers who stayed and their families stayed after them, we start with this guy here, John A. Cornell. And the funny thing is that this is a picture of the stained glass window, which is right behind you there, but you can't really see it very well, so it's better to look at it this way. Anyway, this is a person who I've been fascinated with for a long time, and the more I find out about him, the more questions come up and the more intriguing it is. Sheffield is kind of different in some ways, because a lot of rural communities, they just kind of grew up without much leadership or guidance, you might say. There was a crossroads and people started, building businesses there and things like that. Some places had more of a leader who started things off, maybe shaped them a little bit, and that was the case with John A. Cornell. Now, before people get too confused, there was another John A. Cornell who was his grandson, and this guy lived on the other end of Norman Road by Sager Road. Linus Peck was at Norman Road by Sheffield Road. So this John A. Cornell wrote a couple of local history books, The Pioneers of Beverly and The First Church of Beverly. And he's not to be confused with his grandfather here. So John A. Cornell, who I'm mostly talking about, he was, started out just as a farmer who settled here before Sheffield was Sheffield, and he became a lot of different things in the community. In 1812, he started this church, not here in this nice building, but in his barn, just up the street, and in his house. And he he was a farmer, but he did other things as well. He helped other settlers get established. He acted as a kind of a lawyer. He helped them with a few legal things. He apparently did a little bit of doctor work as well. I don't think he had any training for that, but I don't know exactly what he did. Apparently he had a supply of opium at times, according to local legends, so I guess that could help people if they were suffering. He was involved with Beverly Township when it was first getting organized with local government. He was the first chairman of the township council back in the 1830s. He was also one of the people involved in improving this trail that we know as Highway 8 and getting it covered, paved with stone so that it could be actually more useful for transporting grain and things like that. All right, so who was this guy? Oh, and yeah, here's the other thing is, sorry if you can't make that out too well, but his farm was right in the middle of where it says Sheffield there. You can see that darker part where he had it severed off into smaller lots where people could build businesses. So, most of Sheffield, or all of it at that time, came off of his farm, and it was kind of his plan to build it that way. So, all right, where was he from? The Cornells came from New York State. They were not loyalists in the sense that loyalists were supposed to be Americans who actually fought for the British during the American Revolution. John A. Cornell was born at the end of the war, so no chance of him fighting. His father actually fought in the New York State militia, or served in it on the Patriot side. And where they lived, there's a little red marker there. It looks like it's in Massachusetts, but it's right at by the border of New York and Massachusetts and Connecticut, not too far south from Albany. Well, it's actually a fair ways south, and if you want to get in closer, where he was born was down at the bottom of this map, at that place, near that place, Armenia. He was born in a place called Tower Hill, and then he ended up at the top there, Hillsdale, before he came here. And my family made a little pilgrimage there. I forget how long ago that was, 10 years ago, just to see where he came from. This is Tower Hill. We went up on there and took some pictures where John A. Cornell was born. And then this is Hillsdale, which was called Nobletown when John A. Cornell was living there. Now, this is Cornell University, and John A. Cornell's family were related to the Cornells or the Cornell that started Cornell University. And in Sheffield, in the Cornell family, there was, it was actually kind of a legend that if you were a Cornell, you would get free tuition at Cornell University. And I know one person for sure who's here tonight who tried to get the free tuition when he went there. And Dad, can you add any more to that? What happened with that?
They didn't really want to talk about No, I never went anywhere.
Yeah, you
I
didn't
think
go.
that's just a bad story.
Well, yeah, apparently it was only for descendants of Ezra Cornell. And the Cornells around here were just related to their cousins, so it wasn't going to work. So anyway, the Cornells ended up migrating here to this province, Upper Canada at the time. The lieutenant governor of the province, Simcoe, was trying to get lots of settlers to come in from the United States. And some people thought that was a bit crazy because he said, well, people were saying we don't want all these Americans coming here. Even though the people who were already here were Americans, but they were loyalist Americans. And these other people, you weren't so sure about them. Simcoe said, well, there's lots of them who, they didn't necessarily fight for Britain, but maybe they weren't able to, and there was a lot of pressure on people to toe the line with the Patriots. They were very aggressive, and you got tarred and feathered if you resisted them. So he offered free land to settlers coming here, and thousands of them came, and they ended up outnumbering the loyalist Americans about 4-1. So the Cornells were part of that migration. And whether they were loyal or not, in the history books written by the younger John A. Cornell, he said that they were loyalists, which technically they weren't, but maybe they were somewhat loyal. It's debatable. But the first one who came up was John A. Cornell's uncle Daniel, and I don't know, I didn't see Paul Cornell here, who lives on Norman Road. He's not here tonight, is he? He's descended from Daniel Cornell. And they haven't been in this same neighborhood this whole time. It's like 8 generations or so. But it's funny that there's still a Cornell in the area that's part of the family. But where Daniel Cornell lived at first was at Christie's Corners. He had a farm there in Beverly Township. And he got there in the 1790s. And then John A. Cornell came up to visit him and see what was going on in 1800. Stayed with him for a year, and then they both ended up moving into Waterloo, into Waterloo Township, not into the city of Waterloo. Waterloo Township included Preston and the countryside north of Preston, and then over to the west into Kitchener. And they were settling at the same time that Pennsylvania Germans were first starting to come into the Waterloo area, Waterloo County, Waterloo Township. So where these people were all settling, the first Pennsylvania Germans settled in what some people would call the Pioneer Sports World area. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen the Pioneer Tower Monument, which is in that area. But it's kind of in this area that's between these bends in the Grand River. And the first couple of lots were the Betzners and the Shirts. And then the next few lots were all Cornell. And the Cornells, some of them stayed there in Waterloo for the rest of their lives. And the main intersection in that area, King Street and Sports World Drive, apparently that intersection was known as Cornell's Corners at one time. The cemetery around there became known as the Limerick Cemetery, but originally it was called the Cornell Cemetery. And there was a little church there as well, called the Cornell Chapel. John A. Cornell, his father lived beside the Shirts and the Betzners in that loop of the river there. Off to the right and up higher is where John A. Cornell got his own farm. And that is on Speedsville Road, where if you're coming up through Preston on Concession Road, and once you're heading out of town, it becomes Speedsville. And there's an old church there, which is now the first spiritualist church of Galt. And a couple of John A. Cornell's daughters are buried in that cemetery. So that's a bit of the Waterloo stuff. And then, for some reason, John A. Cornell decided to move here. And it's not exactly clear. He didn't say exactly why he did that. He did, the closest he came to saying why was he realized, or he was concerned that the children in his family wouldn't have schools to go to because most of the people were German. There was a big German majority, so he might have come out here just so that there'd be a better chance of it being more English speaking. He got along very well with his German neighbors, but anyway, he came out here, and I have this picture here because this is where he built his first log house, and this is not the house, but the log house was sitting right in front of this house, which is still there today. Paul Scarborough and his wife have this house. It's right in the middle of the village, and he built his log house there, and just a bit this way towards where we are, he built a barn as well. And eventually he sold it to the Ricker family, Christopher Ricker, and that's whose family is in this picture, and that's who built this house as well in the 1860s. So John A. Cornell lived right there, but he never lived in that house. Right, and excuse me, here's another picture we have of him. He didn't survive long enough to have a photograph taken of him. He died in 1842, but he did accomplish lots of things here in Sheffield. He ended up giving Sheffield its name. Before, it was just known as the Cornell Settlement because a lot of his brothers and sisters came who had been in Waterloo, and they came and settled all around the Sheffield area as well. It wasn't just Cornell's though. There was the Main family was here around the same time as well. Three brothers who had come up from New Jersey and had settled originally at Greensville. They had a connection with the Green family that kind of founded Greensville. And then they moved into this area for some reason, which I don't know why yet. And brings us up to the year 1812. It was 1809 when John A. Cornell moved out of Waterloo and settled here. In 1812, he started preaching in his barn and started the church. And lots of people have noticed, well, that's the same time as the War of 1812, right? So, you know, what was going on? So the more I've looked into it, you realize he, as all men aged 16 to 60 were, they were all required to serve in the militia. And that was always kind of, not too serious before, but now in 1812, the United States is invading this province, armies are coming in, and there's all kinds of Americans already here who people are not sure whether they're going to be loyal to Britain or not, or if they're going to help the invaders. And so calling up the militia, it was quite a serious thing at the time, and they were all required to, in theory, serve. And we don't actually know what John A. Cornell did under the circumstances because there's lots of records, actually, of who served. But the name John Cornell was very popular, and in that family there were 3 John Cornells. All of them first cousins, and there's no way of distinguishing them from each other in the military records. So there was a John Cornell who definitely served in the War of 1812, but we don't know for sure if it was this one or not. And at the same time, he would have been starting a church. The church ended up being a pacifist church. And they ended up, if you were a member of this church, you were exempt from military service. You had to pay a fee, but that was a pretty big thing. That was something that attracted the Pennsylvania Germans here in the first place. But in 1812, it's not necessarily something that John A. Cornell was thinking of. In 1825, he published a book, and he was very much into pacifism at that time, and but he made no mention at all about what happened during the War of 1812 with the men who lived around here, including himself. We know that his brother Aaron served, and he received a medal, which a picture of it here. And apparently all the men that went to Fort Detroit, to the capture of Fort Detroit, were given this medal if they were still alive. It was quite a while after that it was presented. So we don't know if John A. Cornell got one of these. And just because his brother was there, we don't know whether he was or not, but it's quite possible. This is an artistic interpretation of the surrender of Detroit, and there's Isaac Brock. So it would have been quite an adventure for these guys, not just the Cornells, but some of the Maines and other young men who were settled around here, going with Isaac Brock down the Grand River, I understand, and into boats along Lake Erie and up the river to Detroit, and they were able to capture Detroit with hardly any bloodshed, which was really amazing and a good outcome. So that was something that the local men would have experienced. And we know that the local men, they were serving in a specific regiment, the 2nd York Militia. They were right there at Queenston Heights with Isaac Brock when he got shot and killed at Queenston Heights. So some of the men from here probably saw that happen. In this painting, you've got red coats, and then you've got the one guy down there who's not in a red coat, who's representing a militia soldier. So that could be Aaron Cornell or Philip Maine or somebody like that who was there. And there's another one, famous painting of Brock as he's dying. All right, so that's 1812, and people were settling here, building farms. The other thing that was going on, some opportunity that people were taking advantage of, was the fact that this trail that became a highway was the main route for settlers who were traveling to get into the Waterloo area. And it was a good opportunity to get into the hotel business or the tavern business. And they say that at some point in the 1800s, there was some kind of a tavern every mile between Dundas and Galt along what's now Highway 8, or at the time it was called the Dundas-Waterloo Road. So this is one of them here, and this one is long gone since the 1950s. This was originally known as the Babcock Inn. So around the back of it, that little part there was a log building that was started by Babcock, who had one of the first inns or taverns in the area. And then it was added on to later to make this bigger hotel, which the Hamill family ended up with that. And then the Williamsons bought it later on. And when the Highway 8 was bypassed around Sheffield, this building was in the way. And they took it down and said they were going to put it back together at Dune Pioneer Village. And I went there one day when I was younger, very excited to see this hotel from Sheffield, and it's not there. Nobody knew what I was talking about. And apparently they just never got around to putting it back together, even though it would have been a good idea because they don't have a hotel in their village there. But anyway, that's what happened to that one. This was the drive shed, which was still standing not that long ago, and that was a very early building as well. It's got the clapboard siding. And then there was the hotel right in downtown Sheffield, known as the Deary Hotel. It was a James Deary who built this one. And as you can see, the store is on the one side there. And this is a picture taken while they were drilling a well. They probably just had a well that was dug by hand, as most places did. And then when steam engines came along, people started getting these wells that were drilled that you could get down much deeper. So there's that underway. The hotel had two different entranceways. There's the one on the left and one in the middle. And apparently, if you wanted to avoid the bar, if you were a temperance person who avoided all alcohol You could go, I believe it was through the middle one, and then the side one was where the bar was. All right, so another thing going on quite early along the highway, and this was a hotel as well, but this is Romulus, what people call the lost city of Romulus. So for those of you not familiar with where Romulus was, when you go down Highway 8 towards Brockton, you see the Lamb Cemetery. That's where the church was at Romulus, and these buildings were just a little bit further down the highway. So the building on the left was a log hotel. It was a full 2 stories. Apparently it was the biggest log building for a time in the whole district, not just Beverly Township. It doesn't look that big from this perspective, from where the photo was taken, but it was quite a large log building. And a fellow named Henry Lamb started Romulus, and he was probably getting started around the time of the War of 1812. And he built the hotel. He had a sort of a dairy in that stone building that's out front there. The barn that's off to the right is from much later. And the foundation of that barn, you can still see that on the Norrock farm when you're going down Highway 8, so you can see where downtown Romulus was by that landmark. He had big plans that Romulus was going to be like Rome for North America. It was going to be the crossroads of North America. He advertised in Britain in the newspapers to get people to come, and he was going to have a theater and racetracks and all the things that a big city should have. But it didn't really get off the ground. And there's a sketch that somebody made of the hotel. Sorry, this isn't probably too easy to read, but this is a map from 1859 that shows, it actually has Romulus on it, probably the last map that had Romulus on it. And another picture taken of that dairy building, and later on somebody built another tavern. Apparently the highway used to go between those 2 buildings, and then they moved the highway around it, and somebody put a tavern on the other side of that building just to make sure they didn't miss any opportunities for drinkers. Oh, and this was another building. No, sorry, that's the same one from a different angle. It's just a sketch of it. And then this is the Romulus grain mill. And so the other buildings were on the north side of Highway 8, and this one was on the south side. And in the background, it's a bit hard to see, but there's off to the right is a bridge that goes over the Fairchild Creek. It's really overgrown. It's basically a forest now. But if you go along the 6th concession from Settlers Road and hack your way into the bush there, you come to that bridge eventually. So this mill was there, and you can still see when you're driving along Highway 8 the mill race. There's these banks of dirt that were heaped up so that the water could flow through them from a mill pond and into that mill there. There's nothing left of the stone walls. Basically, it was taken away at some point. But that would have been quite a thing to have a mill for grinding grain so close by. This is all that was left of another mill in the Sheffield area, which was on, people might know it as the Browse Farm, where Bert Bruce and Robert Bruce lived. And there's still a mill pond there and a dam. And the dam's actually in better shape now than it was when this picture was taken. But this was, there was a sawmill that operated, they were still operating into the early 1900s. All right, now some other early things. This was the first church building for John A. Cornell's congregation, and it was built in 1834, right here where we are. And the story that if you haven't heard this already, they were going to build it in 1832, and a cholera epidemic came through the area, and so many people died, they needed to use all the wood to make coffins. and they didn't have enough wood to construct this church. So they waited another couple of years before they were able to do that. After this church was built, this stone building was built, they moved the original wood church down the street to, I don't know how to reference it now, but beside Zion Reformed Church. It's not, you can't see it there now. There was also a general store built in the 1830s in Sheffield, and so that building is obviously still there. Eventually a feed mill was added onto it, but that front part there, if you take all the siding off, it's logs underneath there. It's a log building at the front. So that was the first store in the area, and it was the Bond family, which eventually they got the store across the street, the stone building, but it was started by the Lang family. And so there were two stores in Sheffield for quite some time. And the post office, you can see on the sign there that the post office was at the store. Originally, the post office was a separate building, a small building, more this way. And I've never seen any pictures of it or anything. But the post office is kind of a significant thing for Sheffield's history. Getting a post office was kind of a big deal. It meant that your community was actually, a more substantial place. And it's usually that at that time that a community would have, their official name would be decided on. And so apparently until this time, until the 1830s, Sheffield was known as the Cornell settlement. And John A. Cornell himself was the one who was responsible for getting the post office here. So I'm sure he would have felt a bit funny saying, yeah, we're calling this place Cornell Settlement after me. So he called it Sheffield. He was the one that named it. And that's been a bit of a mystery. Why did he choose Sheffield? He wasn't from Sheffield. People thought it had something to do with Sheffield, England. The best guess we have is that he lived, where he grew up in New York State, at what's now Hillsdale. There was a Sheffield about 12 miles away, which is not that close, but not that far away. You can see it there on the map in Massachusetts. What helps with this theory is that he spoke very badly of Hillsdale. So some people might want to name their new home after the place they had come from, but it was clear that he was not going to do that. He said that it was a place where all the arts of wickedness had been perfected, or something like that. So he didn't go on to say, in Sheffield, Massachusetts was a place I always admired, but it was, in Massachusetts they had the Puritan heritage, and maybe Sheffield was a more sort of a pious community. And as part of our pilgrimage, we went there to Sheffield, Massachusetts. So there's their Sheffield post office. It seems like a nice place. We've got a nice covered bridge. All right, so other things that were established early on, and one thing was a school in the 1820s. Now, the first school was a log building. There's no pictures of it, nothing left of it. But it was located where the blacksmith shop was being built later. So that's the Sheffield blacksmith shop and the Sheffield wagon maker shop behind it. And those two businesses often went hand in hand because the wagon maker would use the blacksmith to make the metal hardware that was needed for the wagons they were building. And you can see the wagon maker shop is a ramp to take carts and buggies and wagons up onto the second level. And then they would do the paint work up there in a less dusty room. But anyway, there was a school there at one time. Just a bit closer view. They ended up having a weigh scale. You can see down on the right-hand side there, that weigh scale. That would have been a handy service that the farmers could use for weighing up loads of hay or grain. And there was a blacksmith in Sheffield by at least the 1850s that's recorded. And the wagon maker was there in the 1850s as well. as well as a shoemaker and
Marty, can you back up the previous slide and maybe explain where that is in Sheffield?
oh, right, so that's at the main intersection. If you're coming from the ballpark up to the stop sign there, that's on your left. There's sort of a garage kind of building there that Ken Bridgman has, and but that's not the original building. Even though the blacksmith shop was turned into an auto garage that the Derby family was operating for a long time. So back to the school thing, apparently the second school was this building here, which is the home of Doug and Susan Kimball, I think is their last name. And that's where the old church building ended up as well. You can see it behind the stone building to the right there. So that was, it was part of the main farm though. One of the mains that were the early settlers here had a lot right beside Johnny Cornell's lot. This building here was on the same lot, and apparently it was an early school in Sheffield as well. This was the home that Wilf and Marie Wise lived in. It burned down a few years ago. The Souza and Braga family have owned it for a while. They built a new house there. And yeah, so those are some of the early schools. Other early churches in the area. This was the first Methodist church in the area. And the Brain family had this for quite some time. And Rebecca was here tonight and lived in there for a while herself, so she'd be very familiar with this building. And the Methodists were similar in some ways to the church that was here. It was, it was a denomination that was popular with pioneers. The Methodist missionaries went around on horseback to get to the settlements, and that was very important in the early days because there just weren't a lot of churches at first, and some people were very concerned about that because there were a lot of temptations as well. There was a lot of whiskey. It was very plentiful, and people had a lot of work bees to get things done, which people tend to romanticize that. It is a great ideal to help your neighbors and so on, but there's also lots of stories about how it was hard to get a lot of people to come to a work bee unless there was going to be a barrel of whiskey there for refreshment, and that led to some problems as well. So anyway, some of the pioneers felt it was very good to have the influence of the church around. Another early one, now this is more into the 1850s, this was another Methodist church. This was, the last one was Wesleyan Methodist, which is kind of like a straight from Britain denomination of Methodism. This one was Free Methodist, and this was on Settlers Road, kind of close to where George Tucker was here tonight, lives, just kind of south of his home, across from Ted and Jenny Wilson as well. But this was a building that was basically for the fugitive slave community that was around the Sheffield area, and perhaps the Branchton area as well. You're probably familiar with the Underground Railroad, and this area ended up being a place where a lot of these fugitive slaves ended up being settled. And unfortunately, they weren't made welcome into white society. They mostly had to have their own buildings for school and for church. And so that's what this one was here. And the Free Methodists were very much into abolition and were very popular with the fugitive slaves. The Free Methodists also held meetings in this home here, which apparently was just one half of it originally, and that was kind of like a meeting hall for the Free Methodists. And then the blacksmith ended up buying it and adding onto it, making it a fancier home. And the Free Methodists also met in this building, which is the house that Peter Crawford lives in now, down the highway. And this is when the house was being moved down the highway on logs with a bunch of horses pulling it. This picture shows where it was located originally. This is taken from quite an angle, so it's a little, maybe a little bit confusing. You can see the red brick church and the school there, and then it looks like that building is further away, but it's really just at the intersection that's just right outside our door here, is where that used to be. And that farm where Peter Crawford was at the time split in half from the part that was on the north side of the highway from the south side. So the south side needed to have house and barn and all that, so that's where the house came from. And here's the house moving along. Here's all the horses, and I'm sure some of you have heard before that it ended up getting stuck in the mud, and the horses couldn't pull it any further, and they had to get the steam engine to pull it the rest of the way. Some other early buildings around Sheffield. This is where the Ellises live, just along Highway 8 as you're going up towards Cambridge there. And the upstairs was used to hold court sessions by the local justice of the peace. Not sure how serious matters were held there. Not too serious, I guess, but that was something you don't get nowadays. There were also a lot of these things around the area. This is a lime kiln, and all the mortar that was used in brick buildings and stone buildings, anything you wanted to make with concrete, all the plaster, you needed to get lime and limestone. You would cook in these lime kilns to get the lime that you needed. Also, the lime was put onto fields as kind of a fertilizer in some cases too. So this one was at the corner where Brant County and Wentworth County and Waterloo County all meet along what we would call the 6th concession, right, where it switches from Wentworth to Waterloo. Same place, just you can't see the kiln. And fairly early on in the 1850s, the railroad was being put through, and the closest railway station for this area was obviously at Brampton. And this picture I find it kind of funny because it looks like it's just somebody's backyard, and you can't see the part of the station where the platform is that well. From this angle, it looks a bit more like a train station. But this was a big thing for people, of course, the train being available so nearby. You could travel to some much further away places, visit people that you may never have been expecting to be able to see again, and to do more sightseeing and tourist type things. And it also created a lot of opportunities for farmers to ship out produce. And this is an example here. And this picture was taken on a farm where they were specifically barreling up apples and shipping them out at Brampton in these barrels. And this is a neat picture because the photographer is in the picture. He's the one who's got his hand on the barrel and the barrel press. And they're not making cider with that press, that's just to get the lid on tight so that the apples don't rattle around. I suppose you could make cider with it if you try hard enough. But anyway, that's Sylvester, Maine, and he lived in the middle of the village where Randy and Patricia Kalinko live now, where the spa business is. And we're very fortunate that Sylvester, Maine lived here and was such an interesting character. He got into photography when it was really a very new thing for people to do it as a hobby. He actually considered doing it professionally, but then he just kind of did it as a hobby. He was the jack of all trades. But before this time, this photo was probably taken in 1898 when he first got his camera. This is one of the first pictures he recorded in his journal taking. And before this time, cameras were much harder to work with, and you had to develop the negative right away. So if you might have seen pictures from the American Civil War in the 1860s, there were photographers there. They had to have a covered wagon with a darkroom, set up inside it in order to do that, so that they could process them right away. But by this time, you didn't have to do that. You could do it at your own leisure. A bit less convenient than what we have now, of course, but it was a big step for them. And so you've got people going out into the countryside taking all kinds of interesting pictures, like what Sylvester did. He took hundreds of pictures, and a lot of his negatives survived in a trunk in that same house in the village there. In the 1850s, also, Sheffield got its first doctor, and they didn't live at what people would call the Dr. Seton's house, or the Seton House. He lived a little bit further north of the village, the first doctor. I think it was Dr. Maines was his name, but in the 1850s, we had a doctor here, and there was a number of them. They ended up, it wasn't Dr. Seton that built this house, but he's the best known doctor, of course. And into the 1860s now, this schoolhouse was built to replace some of those other ones that you saw.
Right, is that still standing?
Yep, it's still standing right across from us. How many of you went to school in this schoolhouse? Just raise your hand. I guess I had gym class in there, so that counts too. Did you put up your hand if you had gym class in there? You had that too, right? Yeah. Oh, that's good. That's a lot. That's like 7 or 8 of you. All right. So yeah, by the time some of us were there, it wasn't a one-room school anymore. They built the newer building from the 50s. But here's the interior of it. This isn't from the 1860s. This is 1898, around Christmas time. But it probably looked fairly similar when it was first built as well. Oh, another thing in the 1860s that was going on, there were cheese factories being built all around Ontario, and Sheffield got into the cheese making industry. Now I have a picture of this house because this was the home of the Malcolm family, and they were apparently the first ones to have a cheese factory in the area, and apparently it was on the Malcolm farm, which is on what's now Safari Road. Now this is the home, and it's kitty corner to the African Lion Safari. So at that intersection of Cooper Road and Safari Road. That house burned down, so you can't see very much of it, but you can still see some of the red brick ruins there. And I've never seen any pictures of what the factory looked like or anything, but the Malcolm family, eventually their operations ended up in St. George at a big sort of, it's almost like a plant there. I think it was called the Malcolm's Condensery or something like that. And then another guy built another cheese factory pretty much in the village. And from what I understand, this was very close to where the Humphreys live now, just over that way. And this was the Lang family. There were a couple of brothers. One of them had the general store in Brampton, and the other one had built the stone general store in Sheffield. And so he had a cheese factory and a general store. So you can see on this wagon, cheese is coming from the factory to the general store. And then there was another cheese factory built by the ballpark. And this was I'm not sure, it was probably the Malcolm family that did this, I'm not exactly sure. But this was quite an operation. I have several pictures of it here. It ended up burning not long after these pictures were taken, probably. And the part that has some stone there survived and ended up being somebody's home. But then that burned as well, right? We have an eyewitness who was on the scene at the time. Did it burn right to the ground, or was it saved?
Pretty much it was done. We couldn't live it again, so.
So they would have, this was a great thing for farmers in the area. It allowed them to get into dairy farming in a bigger way. It really increased the dairy industry. They could ship milk to the factory, and then the factory was shipping cheese out all over the place. So that's how the dairy industry really took off, or started to take off anyway. All right, now this is jumping ahead into the 1890s. The Methodists, who had that stone church over there in the west part of the village, upgraded to the red brick church that is across the street from us now. And this is an interior shot of that church from probably the 1920s. And then this church followed suit. It's hard, it's easy to imagine that they probably felt like they needed to do something when that one across the street, it was so fancy, and then they just had this little old wooden one. But some of them might have argued that it was better to be plain and simple as part of the religion, but they decided to go fancy. And this one was built in 1894. By this time, it was a United Brethren in Christ denomination church. John A. Cornell had died back in the 1850s and had aligned him up with that denomination. And this church was the first church of the United Brethren in Christ in Canada, and it was considered their flagship church. They would have their annual meetings here, and it was a big thing for them. And there's still United Brethren in Christ churches around. But most of them ended up within the United Church of Canada, but there's still some that are around. This is a neat shot because at the back of the church, you can see the old wooden one. They pushed it back, rolled it back while they were building the new stone one. And then you can see on the other side, the roofs are on the sheds. We think of those as walls around the church, which obviously they are, but they were originally sheds for parking your horse and buggy in. And I'm sure lots of you have noticed the rings that are there for tying up your horses. This was taken not long after the church was constructed. I think this was the Ladies' Circle. It was a church women's group. They did a lot of fundraising for building the church. It cost $5,000 to build this church. So, and this is a great picture because of all there are many spectacular hats that they're wearing. This is the interior of where we are right now, probably in the 1920s again. There's a very nice chandelier, and there's a scripture up there, and they've actually recreated that at Dune Pioneer Village. They had a United Brethren church there that was from Freeport, which was connected with this church. They were together at one point. And when they were doing a renovation there, they wanted to sort of pay homage to the Sheffield mother church, so they copied that, and so that's there. If you go to Dune Heritage Village, you'll see that. All right, so some other pictures taken by Sylvester Lane, just giving you an idea of what was going on in the countryside. Mixed farming. This is a great picture for mixed farming because it's got a variety of animals mixed together in the yard here. Pigs and chickens and cows and horses. This is a bit of a mix too. It might be hard to make this out, but those are pigs that are stealing the milk from the cow. So that's kind of a bad mix of animals. And Sylvester he did a lot of photography on Sunday afternoons, and you find a lot of these pictures where people just kind of brought things together, and some of them are dressed up fancy still, from church, and some of them are not, and they're kind of interesting pictures. Apparently somebody in the area was into Angora goats, and that was actually popular in the fashions of the time, to have skins from the Angora goat. built into your clothing. Sylvester May took a lot of pictures on the Harvey farm, which is kind of between Sheffield and Brampton. He ended up marrying one of these Harvey sisters, and not this one. I think he courted more than one of them. And anyway, they had a cheese factory on this farm as well. Farmers earlier on in the pioneer days were using their cattle also for oxen. They were training them like horses to do the work, to pull things. And horses, towards the later 1800s, horses were taking over. They were faster, and that's what kind of did in the oxen. You could get a lot more plowing done with your horses. And they brought in these bigger breeds at that time in the later 1800s as well, these perch roads. And I always assumed that this was taken somewhere around Sheffield. There's all these Sylvester Maine pictures, hundreds of them. Most of them don't have anything written on them. And but some of them were actually taken near Thorold when he went to visit his pen pal. And it turns out that this was one of these Thorold pictures, and that's his pen pal who's plowing. This one was definitely taken in Sheffield. These guys owned this steam tractor. This is the original tractor. This is what tractors are named after, a steam traction engine, an engine that can drive itself around. So that's, those guys are Robert Drone and Jack Hood. They lived in the village. They made a living hiring out their services with their steam engine, for, doing thrashing, possibly for no, they didn't do well drilling. There was somebody else who did that, but wood cutting as well, silo filling. Now this silo filling is not using a tractor. They're using the earlier kind of steam engine, which was a portable steam engine. It couldn't drive itself around, so horses would pull that around. So there's that engine. There's a water tank beside it on wheels, a water wagon. And then there's belts connecting to the cutting box that's chopping up the corn, and then an elevator is taking it up into the silo. And at this time, silos were relatively new as well, as far as being like a big barrel standing up, on top of the ground. They used to have pit silos earlier on, but you can see a lot of them had a barrel idea, just wooden staves with hoops around them. But then people were making them out of other things as well, stone and concrete and clay tiles. And I mentioned steam engines being used for well drilling. So I think this guy's name was Graham. If you look in the census back around this time, this guy is listed, and his occupation was given as well driller. So he, apparently there was lots of business for him to go around from place to place drilling wells. And the legend for these guys, for some of these well drillers, was that the amount of time it would take for them to drill your well depended on how good the cooking was in your house. Because they lived with you while they were doing the job. And if they didn't like the cooking, they might get done a bit faster. The steam engines were used in sawmilling as well. And steam engines, were very dangerous. If they weren't handled properly, they could become a giant bomb and explode, and that's what happened. This was near Westover. This steam engine exploded in the sawmill, and pieces of the boiler went all over the place for a long distance. These guys are having a wood harvesting bee somewhere near Valence, apparently, cutting trees down, sawing them up, and splitting up for firewood. Other work bees that they were doing, barn raisings. This is on Settlers Road. It was a main at the time. It's where the Bragas and Sousas live now. Sylvester Maine was a barn builder. The guy who took the photograph was in charge of building this barn. So he took pictures of other barns that he built. Those ones I don't know where they are, but this was taken after one of them was put up, after when they were having their meal, And they just set up a bunch of planks on sawhorses and blocks of wood, and the women had been preparing this big meal while the men had been putting up the framework of the barn. And then presumably there was a dance afterwards. All right, so I'm just going to speed things along a bit more here because I believe I'm into overtime here now. This is the woman that Sylvester Mean ended up marrying, Annie Harvey, believed to be taken during their honeymoon, which was almost literally a honeymoon, but they were making maple syrup instead of honey. This is making maple syrup with cauldrons on the Harvey farm, and that lady there is actually John A. Cornell's granddaughter, Nancy Cornell Harvey, who a lot of people in this area are descended from her, including several people here tonight. World War I, there were a lot of men from the Sheffield area that signed up, and they practiced out of the hall that Don Knight has now. That was kind of the community hall at the time, and they marched down to Rockton on the fairgrounds. There was a building there that's still, people call it the drill hall or the drill shed, although it's not the original one, it was replaced. Here's a picture of it being constructed. I'm not sure, I forget if Sylvester Mean was involved in that, if you just took a picture of it. But that's on the fairgrounds, where the petting zoo or the poultry displays usually are. There's a picture of Dr. John Seton during the World War II giving a presentation to raise money for the war effort. A picture in the Sheffield Cemetery of a young man, Russell Main, who died. And just a little tour through some of the homes in the area. The Everetts live in this house on Seton Road. This is the home I was talking about where the Kalenkos live, that the photographer Sylvester Mean lived in. That's his parents there. Stone house between Rockton and Sheffield on Highway 8. Still there. The stone houses are easy to identify, of course. They haven't changed a whole lot. This is the house that I live in now, and it's very hard to recognize. Went through some major renovations from when this picture was taken in 1898 till now. This is a home in downtown Sheffield. I forget who lives there now. The Jomlings were there for a while. You can see the sidewalk that was there, a wooden sidewalk. These are the same ladies that were riding horses there, except now one of them is dressed as a man, and they're inside that same house. So that's a parlor scene. They were Cornells, or at least a couple, or one of them was. This is another Cornell. It was a Cornell that had that house at the time. So here's his firewood supply. And that's the Knight, the Don and Mary Knight's house back behind him there, I think. So that's it? Yeah. This house was on Safari Road, kind of near where Bob and Carol Cullen live, but long gone. Sorry, my phone is slowing down here. I didn't go that slow. The photographer's uncle lived on this farm on the 6th concession. The Harvey farm, there's a spring house at the base of the hill. Water ran through there, and that was kind of like it was a refrigeration system. It would keep things cool. They put stuff in the water, and probably part of their cheese making operation. This house is still there on Highway 8. After you go over the big hill, it had a veranda that went all around four sides. The Hamill family, again. this house where the Browers live now on Sheffield Road, built by John Rappold, the father of the John Rappold, who was here at this church in some people's lifetimes here. Another stone house in the village here. The Collum family had this for a long time. And it's right at the main intersection over there, coming from the ballpark. Doug, I forget his last name now. Shout it out if you remember who owns it now. Anyway, there's a nice image of what Santa Claus looked like back then. If you look closely, he's in the front there. Kind of scary looking. Another Christmas thing, Christmas tree. Another parlor shop. The banjo, the ladies' banjo was popular back at this time. People like to go out to the lake, and this was probably taken at Blue Lake over kind of by St. George in Paris. That's another Blue Lake shop there. Hunting for rabbits, a very popular thing to do. Sleigh riding, also very popular. And there's a winter scene on the Harvey farm. And just finishing off with some sort of unusual things here. You don't see too many bicycles or tricycles like this around anymore, but apparently they were around back then. And these guys were around as well, and they traveled around putting on a show with their bear. And apparently the bear would climb telephone poles, and it would wrestle. You could wrestle the bear if you paid enough money. And then I'm just going to finish off with I like to show the countryside what it used to look like. There were so many more fences back then that have been removed now. The fields were much smaller, so you had all these rail fences. And then they were replaced with the gauge wire metal fences. And the finishing off, probably what had the biggest impact that changed life in rural areas like Sheffield was when people got cars of their own. This is believed to have been the first car in the Sheffield area, Model T Ford, owned by somebody in the Main family. And kind of put an end to a lot of local businesses, not all of them, but the shoemaker and the blacksmith and the dressmaker and the tailor. People could get much more selection going into town, although it wouldn't fit as well, as having it made for you. And then some of these early cars ended up being used as tractors on farms, as people upgraded and sold them off. Often they became the first tractor you would have. They're called auto tracks. And as I mentioned before, the Sheffield blacksmith shop went out of business because there just wasn't that as much need for horseshoeing anymore. And it was natural for some of these blacksmith shops to convert over to an auto shop or a garage with a gas station. And that's what happened to the Sheffield blacksmith shop. As I mentioned before, the Derby family operated this garage for a long time. All right, so that's my tour, my whirlwind tour through thousands of years of Sheffield local history. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free. If you're falling asleep and you need to get out of here, then go ahead and take off, whatever you prefer. But thank you very much for coming out. And hopefully it was interesting. And I always learn things at these things as well. So if you've got anything you want to share, then please go ahead. It's always interesting to hear, because a lot of the history is just in people's heads, and it's being passed on through families and through people who own the same house, and they tell the people that bought it from them. So it's good to hear those things. So any questions or comments? Sorry, couldn't hear you.
Do they come up here on the boats, or do they come up here across country on wagons?
I don't think too many of them. I haven't heard of too many coming by boat. I think it had always been land. It was, using wagons, covered wagons, that most of them would have come. The loyalists, a lot of them apparently walked. A lot of them were chased off of their land by patriots during the American Revolution, and they just had to leave, with the clothes they were wearing, and they came here as refugees. And during the war, a lot of the women and children were stuck in refugee camps near Montreal. That's what happened. One family that settled around Sheffield in 1812, the Sept family. The men joined the army and fought, and then the women were in the camps in Montreal, and they came, just on foot. So if you're lucky enough to have a horse and wagon, that was a good way to come, but some of them were on foot. All right, anything else?
I want to say thank you very much, Marty, for
You're
bringing
welcome.
us together tonight.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks, Henry. Yeah, thank you very much for coming out, and hopefully we'll do this again. There's lots of ideas of other topics that we might do, so we'll put the word out again for the next one. So thank you for coming. Thank you. You're welcome. See you later, thanks for coming out.